Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we are going to be discussing what happens when public figures are targeted online. Within that subject, we're going to be unwrapping public figures, election officials, those who are activists, and what happens when they find themselves in the public glare and actually when they are actually under attack, both on the online space and physical space, and how they can protect themselves. Talking us through this fascinating topic is Shauna Dillavou. And Shauna is the CEO and founder of Brightlines, an anti-doxxing service designed to protect people running for office. She also leads Security Positive, a digital security consulting firm for the often overlooked security needs of activists. Shauna is a former intelligence analyst with the US government who spent the last decade protecting democracy activists from discovery and reprisal by authoritarian regimes. So let's start the show. Hey, Shauna, how are you?
Yeah, doing great. How are you doing?
Great. Really, really good. Really looking forward to today's conversation. But before we get to that part of the conversation
Yeah.
of what I introduced earlier, I have to ask you the question of what was your first ever social media platform?
Rafi, I feel like what you're asking me is how old I am, which is something you should never ask a woman, even
Never
in
ask a
this
lady.
roundabout way. But my first social media platform that I used, my first account was on Friendster. Does that ring a bell? Friendster?
Friendster. It does.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that haven't heard of it, tell us what it is. Not to age you at all.
Yeah, it was just like a very pleasant, I felt like very kind, really nice UI, sort of predecessor to MySpace. So you could find friends. You could always see who looked at you, which was thrilling. You never had to pay for that back then. I don't quite remember what happened. I think that they didn't sell out to VC, and that's why they kind of went the way of the dodo. And then
Hmm.
MySpace, which was a far inferior product. I mean, in terms of UI, excelled, and
Yeah.
then we know the story of Facebook. But it was
Absolutely. Well,
great.
wasn't Friendster, it was about keeping track of your friends after many, many years. Wasn't that the idea? It was like people who went to
I,
university, college with, and then
that sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right. I don't think I was looking for, because I don't think that everybody I knew from college was like a super embrace, like a beta tester kind of person, like a super embracer of new stuff. And that, keep in mind, like that was such a weird concept. I remember my intern, so this might have been in 2004, 2005, telling me like, oh no, there's a Facebook where you can track what everybody's doing. And I'm like, weird. Why would
nice,
anyone look at that?
nice. Talking about tracking what everyone's doing,
Uh,
you
nice
you are
segue.
someone who works very closely with, let's call them public figures,
Mm-hmm.
those who are trying to do good, activists, those who maybe are, stepping out into the public space, all for good reasons, but then find themselves often inadvertently in the public glare or under attack for whatever they believe in, for whatever they're doing. I'd love for you to just kind of kick off this topic and tell us what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically we work with folks who have a vision of humanity, of us being more than we are acting like at the moment, right? Who want to see a planet that's healthier and that survives, who want folks to enjoy basic human rights, no matter the color of their skin or their orientation or their gender presentation. And those are tough topics in different parts of the world for reasons that are completely unclear to me, no matter how much time I spend thinking about it. So, what we do is support them in that work in the way that we know best how, which is to make sure they can keep doing it. So, in my background, I came to this work because I wanted to support, say, the mental health, the digital hygiene, the security, overall thoughtfulness of like how to ensure that you have a firewall around you and your family and everything that you love so that you can keep doing your work and your your bucket gets filled, like you have enough energy and desire to keep doing the work, because it's a slog to try to
Mm.
change humanity. It's like turning a ship, and to stay hopeful and keep believing in us. I'm sure it gets really hard. That morphed after our 2020 election in the United States into very practically, how do we make sure no one shows up on your doorstep?
Mm.
Because that happens a lot and more to individual folks. And the individual gets targeted in whatever organization that they might be working for. Say it's a political party or it's an advocacy organization. In the United States, it's even the military at times. So these folks are doing their work for this broader cause, purpose, community, company. And when they individually get targeted, that company doesn't always rarely steps up. That organization rarely steps in to help. And so we are here to ensure that link to someone's individual home, their family, their social networks, their colleagues, like that their life doesn't
Mm.
get impacted so directly.
I really like that the word you used was firewall. And for those, taking up a cause or wanting to, make that their life's mission, I feel, especially in recent years, that when they are putting themselves out there, that there is almost an acceptance that whatever comes next to them, they're fair game. Right? They've decided to put themselves out there, but actually they're humans with people, with lives and
Yep.
families and
Yeah.
interactions, and so that firewall where you can protect people's online and physical space to enable them to do that. I love that idea.
Yeah, the idea of a firewall is that you're like stopping the impact radius, right? That you're interrupting that so that you can
Hmm.
attack like the wall, it'll spread out my husband's like obviously a scientist. So like I understand that when you hit wearing a bike helmet, when you hit your head, it spreads the pressure or the impact out across your whole head,
Hmm.
which still doesn't feel good, but it means you don't have a big hole in one spot of your head, which could be deadly, right? So the idea is the same with that firewall, that we will protect by our sheer force, like of numbers, or by
Hmm.
the strength of the overall um, apparatus, like everything
Hmm.
that's inside of it, everything that's you,
But
supports you.
you're not just coming at this as as someone who's interested or someone who's just looking to kind of do good or help those people. Your background is as an intelligence analyst, as an Austin intelligence analyst. So how
Yeah,
did you kind of get that, or how
yeah,
are you using
make
those
that
skills
switch.
now?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because a lot of times the activists will look at me and be like, "How long ago did you leave?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, look, I can tell you USG is not even aware that you exist. Like they let
Mm.
alone cannot understand that this is a problem for them, or I would probably still be with them." So I could see when I was working as an analyst, our work was entirely open source intelligence. We used social media back when like we barely understood it. I was working in 2008, I started. So Twitter was just a few months old, and we didn't really understand the power, let alone how to harness the power of that tool.
Mm.
Um, so we, what I could start to see towards the end of my time there is, and this was after the Arab Spring, I worked on Mexico, and so watching how cartels were using social media to terrify an entire nation, right? Not just the
Mm.
people in a vicinity, but to keep everybody in line, by spreading the images of like decapitated bodies and whatnot. It what I could see was happening was a broader closing, and that if we didn't do more to support the levers of civil society in places where they weren't necessarily closed, but were kind of on that brink of closing, like
Mm.
we weren't going to have a huge trunk of information that we had access to in that moment.
Mm.
And my bosses didn't understand that. I mean, they might have, but that's a difficult apparatus. Like there's just a
Mm.
lot of bureaucracy. My favorite television show is The X-Files. Has been for decades. And I love that idea
Mm.
that there is like the secret cabal in government, because I could never find them or tap into them to get actual stuff done. And so my thoughts about the IC are that, like, yes, lots of really intelligent people doing really important work, and not always a ton of forward thinking vision about technology and where things were
Mm.
going. So
Okay.
what I learned was OPSEC, which was like how to protect myself online to make sure I wasn't
Mm.
somebody that could be found doing this work. It's key. It's key to doing the work. And then the other piece that I learned through a colleague's company, actually, and a colleague that I worked with, her name is Kirby Plessis, and her company is it's still out there doing good work, Plessis Experts Network. Um, was all of the stuff that we use now, but in reverse. So we were teaching federal law enforcement how to target different groups. At the time, like it was DEA, and so we were looking at U.S. side of cartel operations on the U.S. side of the U.S. Mexican border, but how to find their home addresses, figure out their networks, find their email addresses, follow them on social media. Everything that she taught us, that we taught law enforcement, we've been able to reverse engineer to find information on our clients and then scrub it.
Amazing. And so you're today's Mulder and Scully now. You're instead of paranormal activity, you're using your powers for good to
That
help
is a
people.
high compliment, Rafi. Thank you.
But what does that? I kind of want to get into the specifics now. What does that
Yeah.
look like when you say online harassment of public figures? What does that mean?
Yeah. I mean, online harassment feels like such a low base. I mean, it's so subjective, right? Like
Mm.
so there are plenty of studies that show that like bullying happens more often to certain groups and it looks like this and other folks that just don't like being disagreed with. So I'd say online harassment rises to the level of some coordination across
Hmm.
platforms and across groups. There has to be some mass of it. There has to be a number of accounts. It could be like a handful of people, but so long as it's a number of even sock puppet accounts, I think
Hmm.
it counts.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there has to be a level of sustaining attack. That so it has to happen, I would say, over 24 hours. You're getting constantly pummeled. That's a level of
Hmm.
harassment, right?
Hmm.
When it comes to us, it's usually been a couple of days like that. It's been maybe intermittent, but it'll keep popping up. It's across
Hmm.
several platforms, none of which are reacting all that well because they don't. And then they just laid off all the people who would have been helping
Hmm.
anyway. And often law enforcement has already been called and they've been involved to an extent, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
the what happens online, where it begins to cross over to offline is where. So these are kinds of conditions for it being an online harassment experience that we would participate in, support a client through.
Mm.
The kinds of
So,
harassment you might see, calling someone like a name or calling them ugly, like making fun of their appearance, stupid, but and it might hurt.
mhm,
And it's like, well, no one's okay. Does it make you feel unsafe? That's maybe a more subjective question, right? Um, we don't often tell our clients when we find that stuff because they don't. What are they going to do with that information except feel terrible about themselves? They don't need help with
mhm,
that. No one does,
mhm, mhm,
So, what we see that's more in line with risk to us, which is like where the risk starts to accelerate or increase, escalate, is
mhm,
when personal information gets shared, when there's a call to
mm,
find it and share it, when there are certain groups tagged or certain tags used that indicate, well, like this person is a Jew. This person is a person of color. This person has a trans child. This person has um, some other indicator like that to us that this is a person that they have found that they can pick out from a group
mm,
and make an
mm,
example of. So if there's chatter about that in the background, if folks come to them, the person targeted with any slurs that fall in line with sort of with racial, sexual orientation, sort of different representations of a human person,
mm,
or if there are comments made that include, they're coming to them. Shoot, one of our clients was receiving a bunch of text messages, and I'll explain why in a minute. It's a key piece to what's happening here in the States. And in one of the texts, he got a photo of a bunch of guns, and it said, "I have enough information now. I know where to find you." In another
Wow.
case, it was a photo of, out a car window of the person's front of their house with a gun in the foreground. See, in America, we have so many guns, like the physical security risks can't be overstated. Here
Mm.
you find somebody, there are more guns than people. Someone's particularly motivated to
Yeah,
take
yeah.
out their frustrations on you. It's real serious stakes. With a
Oh.
lot of our public figures, because they're either elected or they hold some public office as our election officials were particularly targeted in 2020 and 2021. um, they are often subject to public information laws, and a lot of them may not have been aware, as a professor at a state university, that putting their personal mobile phone number in their signature block would mean that someone someday down the road, 5, 10 years, could file a request for that information for their emails and get their PII and cross reference it in a variety of ways that gets them their home address and their partner's name and their
And
voting.
and
Yeah.
and just for anyone listening, when you PII, just to make sure that
Thanks.
everyone that personal
Yeah.
identifiable information, right?
Yep. Yep.
Identifiable information. Perfect.
Identifiable.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you can say it a couple of ways. We say personally identifiable information. Yeah.
Mm.
And I'll use that term a lot. So thank you for jumping in there. Um, yeah, it's really easy because of the nature of data brokers, and we can talk a lot about that,
Hmm.
to find someone with just one little piece of data.
Interesting. So actually, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone listening that the online space is not always pleasant. There are not nice people saying not nice things, but actually, it's really
Yeah.
important to clarify here that's not what we're talking about here. You mentioned coordinated, you mentioned sustained over multiple platforms, over over a longer period of time, but also as well that you've identified a specific risk. And so that's kind of the difference between someone saying not very nice things, which happens,
Yeah.
which is
It does.
unpleasant, but it happens. But it's as soon as it becomes that risk that
Mhm.
you step in, but actually information has been uncovered, often I'm presuming, about them that they may have that's actually very hard to kind of take down. So once that
Yeah.
happens, what do you do next? Like, how do you kind of spring into action? How are you
Yeah.
able to safeguard them?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, there's a lot to be said about the effects of online harassment, and in and of itself, it is a terrifying experience.
Mm.
Without the risk, I would say, without the specter of physical or offline harassment or harm, it's enough to scare a person. It's enough to cause a trauma.
Hmm.
Particularly because that phone, if you're like me, lives under your pillow as you sleep at night. It's so close to you all the time. It feels very present. And as
Absolutely.
humans, Bruce Schneier says this, his security guy, Bruce Schneier, like, as humans, our brains haven't evolved with our technology. So when you used to hear about tigers attacking, it's because they were nearby. And now you hear about, people are talking about you in a not nice way and they're saying they want to harm you, and it feels very present. So, not to say that online harassment isn't a terrifying thing, but when it crosses over into offline harassment, that's where we get involved, because the risks,
Hmm.
not only do they escalate again in terms of your physical safety, but they spread out to everybody connected to you.
Hmm.
And there are so many connections that each of us have that we may not even be aware of. And I can share plenty of anecdotes. One of the things that we always think about, so ask me about it. One of the things that we always think about is what we call like a risk assessment matrix. And there are two
Hmm.
sides to it, right? The two axes are likelihood and impact. And when
Hmm.
something is high impact, but not super likely, it's something we still address, right? Like, maybe I think the instance of, like, car accidents has gone down quite a bit, right? But we still wear our seatbelts because the impact, quite
Hmm.
literally, of a car accident
Hmm.
could mean our lives, right? We still have all these safety precautions in the car.
Hmm. Hmm.
Similarly, if something is high likelihood but low impact, you're going to deal with it, right? Like,
Hmm.
we deal with phishing. We have to confront that because it's really likely that it's going to happen. And it could be high impact, it could not be, who knows, but it's pretty probable that you're going to get phished. What do you do about
Right.
it?
Yeah.
But this is one of those situations that may not seem high likelihood, and quite frankly is very high impact.
Mm. And especially it becomes higher likelihood as soon as that person becomes that public figure, right? Whether they've chosen it or whether it's thrust upon them.
Whether
That
they've
I'd imagine
chosen
that.
it or not, there are
Yeah.
so many of our clients who were not necessarily public figures,
Mm.
weren't running for office. All these election officials, for crying out loud, what were they
Mm.
doing? Their jobs, they were like chewing gum and like counting votes. It wasn't like they weren't showing up
Yeah.
to work to do a controversial thing. It's that a narrative got created about an election and its outcome long before that election ever took place. And
Mm.
the target became the people who were just delivering the messages of the millions of Americans in 2020 who were voting. Yeah.
A narrative has developed, but also now the amount of information that lives online. People who we wouldn't know who our elected officials were, we wouldn't know who all of these public figures were, we wouldn't know all the activists kind of working in the background
No.
or visible. In fact, in previous generations, they would be struggling to gain any kind of public awareness. But actually now there's so much information about them; it's all at our fingertips. And if someone has
Yep.
ill intent, has a malicious motivation, that actually it's very easy to create targets and then go after them.
Yeah. And Rafi, it's at our fingertips for all time.
Mm.
I mean, listen, I know in Europe there is the right to be forgotten, and I think that that's wonderful. I don't know how often that is exercised by individual people, and I think it's unfair that it has to be a thing that folks have to opt into and go through a process to have completed. Like
Mm.
it's all time. Like you might have done something as a child, and there's a cottage industry of that, where you're looking, especially if you're planning to run for office or put yourself in a public position, like you will go back through your own things and look at them and say, okay, this could be misinterpreted. This could be like interpreted badly. Actually, this sounds awful. I can't believe I used to think this way. But as a human, I've evolved, which is natural. And so let's delete these things because I don't feel like this anymore. I don't say those
Mm-hmm.
things. I don't approach the world this way. Um, but unless you're actively doing that, and there's a lot of stuff. Look, referencing the stuff that you've put out there. Number one thing I tell people is this is not your fault. Quite unlikely the amount of information about you that's out there is because you put it there. In our case in the States, it's because our state and local governments sell our information.
Mm-hmm.
Our
Mm-hmm.
Department of Motor Vehicles will sell our information. Our voter elections board sells the information about us. Our court systems sell information. Our utilities, for crying out loud, sell our information. These public records. So in our case, it's clearly not our fault, right? That this information about us exists. Yeah, the triggering piece being like a tweet that you wrote. Well, you didn't know that you have all of this data out there that's so easy to find you with. We have a client who, bless him, came to us saying, "You're not going to find me. I have been offline for 20 years. I've put my home in this like proxy trust. Like I've done all of this." And he gave us very little data to search on, which I was like, that's just going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And yet we still found him. We found him in a lot of compromising ways because he didn't realize that like his homeowner association put him on, he was on the board. So they put his home address on something. And then his some family member had created a business with his name in it. And so all that data was there. And he was like, man,
Mm.
people do not realize how they impact you when they do those
So it's
things.
so it's is it fair to say that we can no longer control the information that's out there on us?
I think I think I wouldn't be selling a very good service. I think I have to be a little careful to say, yeah, right now you really have to hire an expert. And that's not
Mm.
a fair place for us to be. That's not a fair thing. We are responding at the moment. We've been preparing a comment. There's a US federal agency called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. And we've been preparing a comment for them that every time I work on the draft, I just get angry, just get more and more pissed because it's not an easy look. If you want to exercise your democratic rights in this country, if you want heat or electricity or water
Mm.
in the state that you live, and if you're a member of the US military and you get positioned in a place, you don't choose where you live, that you don't have a way to opt out of some things. Yeah, if
Mm-hmm.
you want to drive
Mm-hmm.
a vehicle and have a national ID card, in many countries that's the case. You don't get to opt out. Now, I wouldn't be a very good security person if I said, well, just because you can't opt out means that you aren't safe. Like, there are plenty of ways that you can manage that data. You just have to
Mm,
know how to do that. How can you obfuscate? How can you create? How can you, what we would call an air gap, sort of like a break, right, between that database and you and your home? How can we eliminate links between information?
mm. And so when you're called upon, like you said, to manage that data was the term you used, I'd imagine it's often you're doing it in a state of, well, for them anyway, crisis, because like you said, you've established risk, right? There is a
Yeah,
risk there. They are maybe in distress. You also mentioned that the law enforcement has been notified. So what happens then? How do
yeah,
you then
yeah.
take those next steps? Again, you're a security and cybersecurity professional.
Yep.
What are the next things that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for re-asking this because I feel like you already asked and I dodged it inadvertently. It's tough. We are not as effective in crisis because this is preventative work, right? But in a crisis situation, we will often advise to if people need to leave the home that they're in, the house, the place that they're at, to give themselves some space, how to manage incoming phone calls, how to make sure they're recording information, right? So creating
Mm-hmm.
a log in case a case needs to be filed, maintaining any emails because they may need to, if we can do some forensic analysis, find the person who's sending them. Those are long shots, right? And that's a whole different industry than what we're working in. But in a crisis situation, those are the things we advise. Get yourself and your immediate family, whoever's been targeted, physically safe. This is how you manage your devices and the ways that folks can contact you in the meantime. And
Mm.
then we go to work. So, what we typically start with are the data brokers. Is that a term that makes sense to you? Data
Yeah.
brokers? Okay. So there are the public facing data brokers, the ones that we often call people search sites. So they're like the whitepages.com, sort of like telephone books, right? Except very 21st century, where they're connecting you to your whole life, not just where you currently live, all your contact points, everybody you know professionally, and then everybody you know personally. So these are very souped up, like very like insane, right?
Mm-hmm.
White pages. So we will start by removing you from those as quickly as possible because those tend to have really great search engine optimization. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we can start to remove you there and the people around you, so say it's your parents or your partner or your children that you're most concerned about, the people who share an address with you or who are physically proximate to you. So say your parents watch your children, they live 2 blocks away, we would also really want to protect them at their home. If it's your child's school, if it's your connection to your company, we would work on making sure that those things were they most at risk, we would eliminate that risk as quickly as possible. And it often
Mm-hmm.
starts there. So their opt out procedures are different and they're challenging. Every one of them is different across all the hundreds of sites that exist. And we know, we have partners who can find that information and scrub it as quickly as possible. Some of them like to drag their feet and take a couple of weeks to get it down. So we know that if it's like, oh, my life is going to take 4 to 6 weeks because that's what they like to do, I'm happy to blow them up on your podcast because that's bullshit. They will, like, how do we mitigate the information that we've seen on there? If you can log in and create a profile and delete most of it, or we can do that as your proxy, then we'll do that in the meantime until they actually take you down. Past that, we get into, where your image exists that maybe you weren't aware of, because that often happens, particularly with women. I will tell you something, Rafi. I didn't know there was such a thing as a feet wiki. And I do now, and I wish I didn't. I would have died happy not knowing that if you take pictures of your feet, they could show up there for feet fetishists without your knowledge or consent.
I actually learned about this recently because a friend of mine experienced this. She found out that her photos of her were appearing on websites, on multiple duplicated websites. So it wasn't just taking it down from one. She really
No,
didn't know,
no,
A, how to process that information, but then also how
no.
to go about remedying this information. So actually,
You,
this isn't something I knew about before, but have only heard recently, which is
it's
strange.
horrible. Yeah.
Right.
Look, Apparently, if you are some level of attractive young woman, your photo will get taken over and over, and it will be on porn sites. Not necessarily that you're doing a pornographic act. That's fine. If folks are consensual and like getting paid to do it, I don't have a complaint with that. But if your face is getting monetized on a site that could harm your financial future, right? Like your ability to
Mm,
get
mm.
work and keep work because it looks like you agreed to this with your
Wow.
face, which not necessarily every pornographic, like thing has a face attached to it necessarily, because folks may want to maintain a little anonymity for good reason, privacy for good reason, right? So these folks, when that happens, we have been just really struggling, running into a wall, because a lot of those sites will not honor our takedown requests or ask for more information when we do
Mm.
make those requests, because they really don't want to let go of that face and the money that they're making because of it. And right now, there's no authority really pushing them on it, especially if you can't find the website owner. So we'll do facial recognition just to make sure that we understand everywhere where you are, and that there aren't photos out there that you didn't know about that could be potentially leading to your front door, or to your family, or to your colleagues. I found photos of, it's so wild. I found a photo that I had done when I was a fellow to the EU that was just like on a poster behind a person speaking. And the person speaking just so happened to be speaking about something I didn't necessarily align with. But my face was in the photo, and so I was like easily getting tagged in this, and I we ended up asking to have it removed. Like, I don't want
Wow.
folks to think that I'm part of the alt-right in Germany, like, because I'm in this image. I just posed for a photo for a fellowship thing. It had nothing to do with this. So
Wow. So you've actually personally experienced it firsthand. Like that's actually
yeah.
something's happened to you now.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. No, I would nothing. There were no repercussions because we found it and we removed it. I was like, I can see this getting ugly. So this is the dimension that I started to mention. We're going to think about this stuff for our clients going into as far as we can imagine for them in their lives.
Hmm.
Like, this isn't something where we're like, okay, this is an immediate risk, take it down right now. We're thinking like, okay, right now, what we understand is that your data exists on this database. It has not been sold here or here, but the potential exists. So we think that you should do this now because the impact will be so high. So we'll be thinking about that into the
Wow.
future. But to continue answering your question, images, we look at accounts, we look at public records. And it's the public records that are the big piece, and that takes usually the longest. And then we like to look on search engines everywhere to see where your data pops up. The hard part with search engines is always that, like, you can't necessarily get your information out of PDF documents of things that were posted 10
Hmm.
years ago. So
Hmm.
that's a lot of work.
Wow. That
Yeah.
does sound like a lot of work. But also, I wanted to ask you because a lot of the anecdotes or examples you referred to have been to the US, but I know the US isn't the kind of the only geography that you work in. I'd
Yeah.
love to kind of talk to us briefly about the work that you do
Yeah.
around the world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with our work with Brightlines, a lot, it's not entirely in the US, but mostly it is there now because the need is so great. Like I said, we have
Mm,
so many guns, and we have no federal privacy protections, and
mhm,
only a handful of states have enacted anything only one or two that have anything that's kind of comprehensive, and
mm,
nothing that really governs the sale of data by state agencies. In other parts of the world, this is not different. So a lot of folks have adopted the GDPR framework, which is really great. Now, outside of Europe, right, in the EU, and I think that's fabulous. It's a great place to start. But even there, what you're running into is an opt out. So we find that we can be useful even in places that have frameworks. In fact, far
mm,
more useful, because there isn't always a lot of enforcement. And if there is, it's because you've requested it. But you'd have to know where to search. You'd have to know how
mm.
to find it. And then you'd have to know how to request that it be removed. It's
Wow.
That's hard.
Mm.
That's a
So
lot
there's
of
still
like,
work.
that's our
There's
secret
work to
sauce.
do, right? That's what you're saying. Even you would think,
Yeah.
kind of, you're in Europe, you're an elected official, public figure. Okay, I'm in Europe. That's fine. Everyone knows that there are stricter data privacy guidance, but actually, what you're saying is there's still a lot of
Not
work to do
always.
in both
Yeah.
the
No,
discovery and takedown.
yeah, I had I had a client as part of security positive work who was based in Sweden. He was Norwegian, but based in Sweden. And his telecom, like his mobile service provider, was selling his information, his location information. And I remember reaching out to our colleagues at CRD. Oh, I'm going to have to pause and think about what that is. The acronym is. I might have to look it up. Give me one second. But they civil rights defenders. I think. Let me just make double sure because I want to shout them out properly. Yes, civil rights defenders. They're based. So I reached out to a colleague at CRD, civil rights defenders. They're based in Stockholm, and bless him, he said, it still happens. It still happens all over Europe, but folks sell information, and we have these transparency laws that were written really, I think, before we understood the value of that information. And so in some places you have transparency laws that get interpreted to supersede your GDPR framework through your privacy frameworks. So for this person to get his information removed, and he lived in a rural area and he was a known public figure and he'd been involved already in like a mass violence event, he really had to go through the hoops. Like he had to have my colleague at CRD support him to get that information not only identified, but taken down.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's not, and even still, look, I mean, I might Google someone and search for them. We have had clients in the UK and Ireland, and we can still find them. And we can still find them in ways that are compromising. And sometimes it's data brokers, and sometimes it's public records that are used transparently, and sometimes it's stuff that, was part of an alumni association dinner, and their image appears, and it appears next to a partner, and the partner they want to protect. So it really comes down to their priorities.
Like the example you gave before, it's not the individual, it's their network around them, right? And people, if they might be aware of their individual footprint, but they certainly are not aware of their circles around them.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Sorry,
just to bring home the point, I just want to make sure that it's clear. It's not your fault. You didn't do this. Like these folks have been buying and selling and profiting from your data for decades now. And they've made so much money that they're protecting that industry so well that it's nothing that you're contributing on your social media spaces is really the thing that's going to get you hurt. It's just the fact of your existence, someone not liking that, and then being empowered to use data that is so freely available across the globe. We were just writing a proposal this morning for Pakistan because it's the same situation where, especially now that things are in particular political turmoil, individual people are being targeted, and they have government agencies that sell their information along with their national ID number. It's not different, the world over.
I think for anyone listening, and myself included, this has been a real education, this conversation, because I think
hope it's not too terrifying.
I mean, it's terrifying, but also I think it's a really incredibly important. And one of the aims of this podcast is to kind of shine a light on dark corners of the internet, of the online space. We go about our day-to-day business, and I don't know, I'm sure there are many listeners like me who are complete news junkies, right? And we come across many stories a day involving people who are in the limelight. And when we were off air, we're not talking about celebrities here who have the resources. We're talking about officials, activists, people who have been thrust into the limelight, people who have made active decisions, often at great personal cost or at great hesitation because of the impact that it's going to have on the networks and the communities around them. So it's been really interesting to delve into this topic and understand it. And also, I think it's incredibly important, the fact that now people feel more aware, but also possibly more protected as well, going into and making decisions to become public figures. So thank you so much for talking through. We could have been here for another couple of hours, and I would have gladly done so. But what we like to do is what we like to do is finish each episode with asking the question of what is one good thing, one bad thing, and one fake thing that you are seeing in the online space?
Oh man. Okay, so one good thing, you're gonna really get me, I think, as like a kind of hater here. But one good thing is the end of Twitter as like a legit thing. Like,
Okay.
what a hellscape. And I think it has been for a long time. It's been a particularly harmful place for a lot of people. And so I'm really kind of glad to see it lose so much legitimacy, even if it came at like this blue check for money thing. Great. Like, I'm happy to kind of have the curtain pulled back. A little sad to see it go, but I'm also glad to be like, look, this has not been a healthy situation for a long time. And if one
Okay.
person with a lot of money can like do some serious damage to it, so be it. A bad thing. Uh, you know, speaking of blue checks, the Google just rolled out this like blue check verification system that immediately it had to roll back in because it had some security vulnerability in it. That sucks. Like, I guess the bad thing is like, do we need to keep relying on the platforms themselves to do those kinds of verifications? That
Mm-hmm.
seems like maybe not the best long-term solution.
Mm-hmm.
Fake thing. I am not up on fake stuff right now. Um, I just keep thinking Bitcoin, and I know that's like not a current example, but like what a fake, wonderful fake. No, listen, we work with AI, so like I can tell you that I like using ChatGPT. I like it. I like using that stuff. Do I think that AI is going to be eating our lunch? I think that's a little fake.
Mm.
I think, like any
What the
technology, it has the power we give it. Yeah,
I see. So the fake is the claims or the hype around AI,
I think
right?
so. Yeah, I think so.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Shauna, this has been fascinating. I've really loved this conversation. I'm really glad we were connected via Welton, who was a previous episode. If you haven't heard that, go check that out. He is an
Yes.
expert in alternative and kind of almost marginal social media sites and the threats that come from there. So give him a little shout out there. Shauna, for those
Yeah.
people who want to follow you, where can they read about you? Where can they read about your work and your kind of the new things that you're putting out there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm on Twitter, which was why I was laughing. I'm on Twitter. Not that I ever post anything there, but I love to get your DMs there if you're interested. And I'm at Shauna Lead, Lead. And then the best place to follow along with what's happening with Brightlines is LinkedIn, which I know sounds every bit of a person in midlife, but that is where we're at. We're very careful with how we do social media, and we certainly aren't going to bombard you with a Substack. So hit us up on LinkedIn,
Great.
said the
Thank you.
nerd.
Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everyone who's been listening. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.